Certainly.
Look at that.
Hell!
No, God! No, God, please, no! No! No!
Stop the prime time, bitch!
Pull the string! Pull the string!
Do what Bella says. Pull the string. And when you pull that string, it'll start a brand new episode of Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast. I'm your host, Michael Lucht, and this is round 3, I believe, of the Halloween Get Down. This one's going to cover 4 mysterious deaths. Now, I say mysterious. Some of them are... It's quite obvious what happened. It's the circumstances surrounding some of the deaths that make these definitely mysterious in certain cases. Certain cases out of the 4, you don't need a coroner to figure out how exactly the person involved died, but once again, it's the mysterious circumstances surrounding. Let's jump right into number 1. Netta Fornario. November 1929 on the Isle of Iona, off the west coast of Scotland. Rugged cliffs, rolling fog, and an air of isolation can make even the bravest of visitors uneasy. Here, the story of Netta Fornario unfolds, a woman whose death would leave more questions than answers, and whose life had been deeply entrenched in spiritual exploration and occultism. Netta was 30 years old, a solitary figure, drawn to the mysteries that most of her contemporaries dismissed as superstition. She was a member of the Rosicrucian Order of Alpha et Omega, a practitioner of astrology, alchemy, and ritual magic. Locals remembered her as quiet, enigmatic, and often seen wandering the coastline at dawn, murmuring what they perceived to be incantations, or making meticulous sketches of the cliffs and hidden coves. At some point, Netta stated she'd arrived on the island of Iona because she sought to undergo, quote, a terrible case of healing, unquote. It's old-timey speak, if I've ever heard it. This would require the channeling of, quote-unquote, green ray elementals. This is another name for fairies and nature spirits believed to be responsible for healing and growth. Perhaps she believed Iona was home to a pure spiritual force, a life force, or alternatively, some unknown evil she was destined to come into conflict with. On November 16th, Netta seemed to be in the throes of some kind of anxiety attack, claiming that she needed to leave the island immediately, that she'd seen quote-unquote ships cross the sky, and was having strange visions. The host family she was lodging with had noticed her drastic shift in appearance, having seemingly aged overnight while developing a desolate, faraway look in her eyes. That 1,000-yard stare you often hear people mention. Not long after, she inexplicably disappeared, instigating an island-wide search, one which, for some reason, on such a tiny island, took 2 days to find a woman who seemingly traveled over a mile barefooted through the night, attributing to theories that she may have even somehow levitated. And then one morning, she's found dead. Her body was laid out atop the local fairy hill, Scythian Moor. Despite the cold, she was completely naked, with her black ritual cloak folded up neatly and placed next to her. Her body lay in the remote northern cove of the island, sprawled over a cross carved into the dirt. Around her were objects, symbols etched into the stones, small arrangements of candles, and what appeared to be personal talismans. In one hand, a knife, with another laid near her body. According to various recollections of the story, the silver crucifix she regularly wore had somehow turned black. At first glance, the scene suggested a ritual, or perhaps a woman overwhelmed by the elements. Official reports attributed her death to exposure compounded by a seizure. Some suggested she may have suffered a heart attack, but the details don't quite fully align. Witnesses, those rare few who claim to have encountered Netta in the prior days, reported her obsessively preparing for something only she understood. Neighbors supposedly told investigators they saw strange flickering lights about the cove at night, accompanied by a low, rhythmic chanting. Allegedly, Netta was also repeatedly sighted in the company of a tall, unidentified, cloaked figure in the lead-up to her disappearance. Investigators cataloged her belongings, noting journals filled with meticulous observations, diagrams of the coastline, and esoteric notes referencing spiritual entities and energy points across the island. No trace of foul play was found, no footprints, not even her own. No signs whatsoever of struggle beyond her collapse. And yet, some things remained inexplicable. Her body exhibited markings, faint abrasions in precise patterns on the bottoms of her feet and along her arms and shoulders, inconsistent with a simple fall or seizure. Some believed these marks were self-inflicted, part of a ritual she intended to complete. Others whispered that they could not have been produced by her alone. The coroner's report was careful, clinical. Death due to hypothermia and natural causes. But the cove, the symbols, the timing, these details refused to be contained by a single, neat explanation. Was it merely exposure to the elements, or was it to elementals? Netta's friend and fellow occultist Dion Fortune did an episode on her way back in the day when we first started this show, had her own theory. Quote, "I knew Miss Fornario intimately. She was half English and half Italian, and was especially interested in green ray elemental contacts, too much interested in them for my peace of mind, and I became nervous and refused contact with her. It appeared to me that Mac, as we called her, was going into very deep waters, even when I knew her, and that there was certain to be trouble sooner or later. She had evidently been on an astral expedition from which she never returned. She was not a good subject for such expeditions," unquote. Fortune also claimed to have seen marks similar to those on Netta's body on others, claiming they were indicative of psychic attack by the former leader of Alpha et Omega, one Moina Mathers, wife of McGregor Mathers, former head of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Even though Moina had been dead for 18 months at that point, her motives for the alleged supernatural attack have never been specified. Stories persisted. Fishermen claimed that on fog-heavy nights a lone figure could be seen at the northern cove, reciting words into the wind, though by then Netta had been gone for years. Letters sent to spiritualist societies hinted that her work was on the verge of revelation, something that might challenge conventional understandings of consciousness, of life, or even death itself. Some historians would dismiss these tales as folklore, cautioning against the human tendency to mythologize tragedy. Others would argue that there was something profound, some energy or presence, something left behind by a woman who sought to bridge the natural and the supernatural, only to vanish in the midst of the unknown. Netta Fornario's death remains a nexus of contradictions: solitude and society, the ordinary and the mystical, a life ending naturally yet leaving the shadows of many a question mark. What exactly occurred that dark early morning on the Isle of Iona? Was it mere exposure to the elements, a ritual gone wrong, or something that cannot be explained by science or rational thought alone? In the end, we are left with the scene, the objects, the journals, and the stories. Fragments of a life lived at the edge of the ordinary. And, perhaps, that is enough to make the listener wonder, how thin is the line between the world we understand and the one we can only feel? Part 2. D. Scott Rogo. 1990, Northridge, California. Quiet suburban street tucked between hills and freeways. An ordinary American neighborhood at first glance, but behind the walls of one modest home, a story unfolded that would disturb those who followed the strange and unexplained. D. Scott Rogo, 40 years old, was a parapsychologist, an author, and a man whose life revolved around the study of phenomena most dismissed as fantasy: ESP, hauntings, near-death experiences, and the like. He'd written more than a dozen books, lectured across the country, and corresponded with individuals claiming to have encountered the odd or paranormal firsthand. Rogo was known among his colleagues for being meticulous, almost obsessive. His research left no details unchecked, yet for all his focus upon the unknown, the circumstances of his own death would forever remain a mystery, one that has baffled both law enforcement and the paranormal community alike. On a March morning in 1990, Rogo's body was discovered in his home. Multiple stab wounds had ended his life, each one precise, fatal, and deliberate. The scene suggested violence of the most personal kind, yet there was no clear motive. No forced entry, no sign of robbery, no footprints beyond those of Rogo himself and the responding officers. The investigation quickly turned procedural. Local police questioned neighbors, reviewed his recent communications, and examined his extensive personal and professional records. They found letters from colleagues, notes for some upcoming lectures, and detailed accounts of his ongoing paranormal investigations. Nothing suggested he had enemies, or that his work would attract violent attention, yet the wounds on his body suggested the opposite: a struggle with someone intent on silencing him. Initially, suspicion fell on John Batista, a man known to Rogo through his volunteering and charity work at a local soup kitchen, who was alleged to have visited Rogo previously. Rogo was remembered by both his friends and colleagues as someone who'd frequently go out of his way to help others. John Batista was arrested, tried, and convicted, but this conviction was later overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct. No one else was ever charged, and the case remains officially unsolved. Rogo's death ignited a darkly paranoid chorus of whispers. Was this simply a homicide motivated by some hidden grudge, or could his research have drawn attention from forces, human or otherwise, that are rarely acknowledged in daylight? Colleagues recalled that in the weeks before his death, he had expressed an uncharacteristic sense of unease. He spoke of anomalies in his data, phenomena that defied explanation, of experiences that made him question the boundaries between life and death itself. Just to provide listeners with an initial reference guide into exactly just what kind of subject material that Rogo was frequently deeply immersed into investigations of, let's take a quick look at a portion of his bibliography. First up is Leaving the Body, A Complete Guide to Astral Projection, published in 1983 by Prentice Hall and later re-released by Simon & Schuster in 2008. The work is a quote-unquote practical handbook, in Rogo's words, for inducing out-of-body experiences, aka OBEs. LOL. Or astral projection. Rogo breaks down the phenomenon into 8 methods, from progressive muscular relaxation, dietary control, visualization, to concentration techniques, with the aim of achieving safe, controlled separation of consciousness from the physical body. He supplements the how-to material with a survey of scientific and anecdotal research, historical accounts, modern experiments, and potential applications, spiritual, psychological, or even therapeutic. The tone is optimistic. Rogo sees OBEs not merely as exotic curiosities, but as a frontier for human consciousness studies. Among Rogo's work, this stands out for merging the mystical, such as astral travel, with methodological instruction. His attempts to give readers the start here first steps rather than just speculation and theory. Next, we've got Miracles, a parascientific inquiry into wondrous phenomena, published in 1982 by the Dial Press. In this volume, Rogo shifts away from strictly parapsychological lab-style phenomena and tackles the broader, vastly open category of quote-unquote miracles, events that appear to exceed known scientific explanation and are often interlaced with religious or mystical significance. He provides case studies, healing events, prophetic visions, spontaneous recoveries, and other quote-unquote wondrous phenomena. Rogo applies a parascientific lens, meaning he remains open to the phenomena but insists on rigorous documentation, skeptical evaluation, and the acknowledgement of uncertainties. The book explores the boundary between open mysteries and pseudo-miracles, and asks whether so-called miracles might point to some larger structures underlying our reality, rather than simply violations of natural law. The book exemplifies Rogo's balanced style, neither pure believer's apologetics nor dismissive skeptic, but rather an investigative approach to phenomena that many prefer to leave in the realm of faith or folklore. Following that, we have The Haunted Universe, a psychic look at miracles, UFOs, and mysteries of nature, published in 1977 by New American Library and reprinted by Anomalous Books in 2005. This is one of Rogo's more wide-ranging books. It links together phenomena often treated as separate, such as UFO sightings, cryptids, hauntings, and psychical experiences, under a single domain of quote-unquote psychic projection or psychic ecology. He proposes that many of these mysteries share a common structure: consciousness projecting into unusual forms, whether as anomalous creatures, apparitions, or non-material intelligences. Rogo suggests that UFOs and cryptids, such as Bigfoot, may not be extraterrestrial or zoological in the conventional sense, but rather psychic phenomena manifesting in accordance with the observer's mind and or cultural context. The tone is speculative, but grounded in research, history, and case documentation. The book is a good example of how Rogo takes disparate paranormal topics and weaves them into a unified theoretical framework, appealing to those with interests in the strange gray areas where occultism, parapsychology, ufology, etc. intersect. Next, we've got Phone Calls from the Dead, the results of a 2-year investigation into an incredible phenomena with Raymond Bayless, published in 1979 by Prentice Hall. Co-authored with Raymond Bayless, this book investigates the phenomena of what Rogo and Bayless call, quote, spirit telephone calls, unquote, instances where individuals claim to receive phone calls from deceased friends or relatives, often a single ring, a voice, or a disconnected call with no visible source. They document dozens of cases, analyze available patterns such as time, psychological state of the phone call's recipient, message content, correlation with death or near-death events, and so on. It discusses possible explanations such as telepathy, residual voices, electronic anomalies, etc., and weighs skeptical interpretations. Rogo treats the various accounts with seriousness and invites the reader to consider whether these calls might represent an unexplored frontier for the possible survival of consciousness. This work stands as one of Rogo's best-known titles, focused neatly upon unusual phenomena, bridging the gap between serious research and sensational narratives. Next, we've got The Search for Yesterday, Critical Examination of the Evidence for Reincarnation, published in 1985 by Prentice Hall. In this book, Rogo examines claims of reincarnation from the standpoint of psychical research. He reviews case histories of children who claim past life memories, assesses hypnotic regression data, examines various cultural religious expectations, and reviews critical skeptical arguments. Rather than simply cataloging evidence, he evaluates methodology, sources, alternative explanations such as cryptoamnesia, suggestion, cultural contamination, and the like, and the philosophical implications if reincarnation were proven to be true. The book seeks to provide a sober, balanced overview and invites readers to consider whether reincarnation can be meaningfully tested. The book offers forth a model of how to critically evaluate controversial phenomena while still remaining open-minded. Finally, we've got The Infinite Boundary, a psychic look at spirit possession, madness, and multiple personality. This one sounds especially interesting. Published in 1987 by Dodd, Mead and Company. Here, Rogo turns his attention to the boundary between normal and pathological consciousness, specifically possession phenomena, amalgams of madness or disassociation, such as multiple personality disorder / dissociative identity disorder, and reports of demonic or spirit influence. Rogo surveys historical cases of possession, modern clinical reports of multiple personality, cultural belief systems about spirits, and considers whether these are causes of psychopathology, psi phenomena, or cultural psychological constructs. He argues that to understand the quote-unquote infinite boundary of consciousness, one must consider the possibility that what psychiatry labels as madness may intersect with the paranormal or psychical. This book offers a darker, more interdisciplinary angle: psychology, psychiatry, parapsychology, cultural studies, etc., into subjects such as the occult, crime, and general fringe research. Some of his journals, partially recovered, partially missing, contained accounts of shadowy figures, objects moving on their own, and unexplained sounds during his late-night investigations. In reading them, one cannot help but feel a sense of foreboding. The researcher, always chasing the unknown, may have glimpsed something he was either not meant to know or not prepared to confront. Neighbors reported hearing arguments late that night. Though they could not identify participants, others spoke of a strange calm that seemed to hang over the house in the days after Rogo's death, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath to avoid notice. One of his neighbors would eventually call the police for a welfare check after realizing his sprinklers had been on for an inordinate amount of time. California. Paranormal enthusiasts eventually noted the irony. A man who dedicated his life to studying the unseen, himself a victim of violence that remains unexplained, bordering on the enigmatic. D. Scott Rogo's death is a confluence of facts and questions. The physical evidence, the investigative procedures, the overturned conviction, these are all concrete. The few remaining bits of unassailable factual information related to the case. However, the circumstances surrounding the end of his life, the possible links to his work in the paranormal, the missing journal pages, the unanswered questions, these are the lingering shadows that turn a tragedy into a mystery. The exact same enigmatic shadows that he spent nearly his entire life chasing and investigating. In the end, Rogo's death remains a puzzle. Just as one piece falls into place, another seems as if it's been deliberately removed. For those who follow the line between the known and the unknown, this is something of a cautionary tale. Even the most rigorous pursuit of truth cannot always protect one from the mysteries that exist right beside us. The house now stands empty, the books remain, and the questions linger unanswered and waiting to be confronted. Next up, we've got Christopher Whiteley. Covered this case a long time ago as well in a werewolf episode I did with my brother. This is a really strange one, and this happened close to home. It's very weird. 2020, Hood County, Texas. A landscape of rolling fields, remote ranches, and dense patches of woodland where shadows stretch long under the afternoon sun. It's here that a young man named Christopher Whiteley would meet a fate as grisly and sudden as it was enigmatic. Christopher was 28. Christopher. Known for his quiet demeanor and an affinity for the outdoors, friends remembered him as someone who could disappear for hours on local trails, navigating the countryside with ease. But on one fateful day, that familiarity with the land would unfortunately neither help nor protect him. Christopher's body was found in a secluded area, alone, the ground around him undisturbed, the crime scene gruesome. Initial reports suggested an attack by a mountain lion, a terrifying but not impossible scenario given the region, with records indicating a total of 30 confirmed big cat attacks in the area over the span of the last 100 years. Yet investigators quickly encountered inconsistencies. No tracks of the alleged predator were conclusively identified. Wildlife officers noted that no mountain lion activity had been recorded in that area for months. Local ranchers reported nothing unusual, and yet the injuries were clear. His neck was devastated by deep puncture wounds and vicious lacerations that were severe, concentrated, and quite obviously indicative of some savage, animalistic ferocity. But questions remain. If it was an animal, which animal? If not a mountain lion, then what? Somewhat unbelievably, despite the persistent disagreements between experts and authorities, Christopher's death was ultimately ruled as an accident, quote unquote, by the coroner's office and remains classified as such to this day. The forensic examination by the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office noted puncture wounds consistent with a large carnivore, likely a mountain lion. However, there were also strange abrasions which didn't fully match that of any known predator profiles native to Texas. Could it have been a rogue animal? A hybrid? Perhaps something else entirely. Neighbors recounted strange sounds throughout the area during the week leading up to Christopher's death, eerie howls that didn't match that of any known domesticated dog breeds. There were supposedly even fleeting glimpses of some unknown shadowy figures seen deep amongst the trees. Many dismissed these stories as runaway imagination or a form of mass hysteria. Others, recalling local folklore, spoke in suspiciously hushed tones of a monstrosity known as the Dogman, a legendary predator that had allegedly haunted ranchers for generations, both at home and abroad. The Texas Park and Wildlife Department, Texas game wardens, and even a federal government trapper with the Department of Agriculture all investigated this incident thoroughly, yet all of them also left the case with many unanswered questions, especially after they sent out additional biologists and other experts to examine the scene of Whiteley's death, only to conclude that not only was there no evidence of a mountain lion attack, but there was apparently no evidence of any known animal present whatsoever. There were no other victims, no sign of any repeated attacks, and the land itself seemed to hold its secrets closely. Amidst thickets of trees dense enough to conceal the ordinary, and perhaps even the extraordinary. In fact, it's a somewhat prominent environmental feature that local paranormal researcher Jason McLean, author of Metroplex Monsters, calls the Green Wall. Clusters of densely wooded areas that exist along the Brazos and Trinity Rivers, which have occasional locations exhibiting immense complexity, stretching outwards from either side of the highways, while hiding their deceptive depths from all those who are, more often than not, simply just passing through, too preoccupied with their drive to observe these frequently dismissed details. Christopher's death, initially recorded and classified as an animal attack, only to then immediately have this particular conclusion soon called into question, essentially illustrates local law enforcement's dilemma of being given conflicting information from the local and federal experts in their respective fields, which inevitably end up contradicting each other. Regardless, the incident has left the community somewhat shaken when taking everything into consideration. How could a man familiar with the land, both careful and observant, end up falling victim to some unknown predator, and in such a grisly manner? And if this predator is in fact actually real, why has it never been seen before, nor has it been seen ever since? Folklore often thrives on tragedy, Explanations, even strange ones, flood the void of missing information. Some locals quietly whispered that Christopher's death had an unnatural quality to it, a sense that he had been hunted, not just by a violent predator, by something completely unknown. Others pointed to an apparently pre-existing pattern of anomalous quote-unquote animal attacks in the area, noting that these injuries bore similarities to other strange, unclassified attacks reported elsewhere throughout rural and urban America. A list of victims that includes the names Lydia Elaine Chappell, Deanne Lynn Tavanis, Netta Lee Adams, Corey Godsey, Tony Aarons, Amber Miller, and Carlon De La Cruz, all of whom have had their deaths officially attributed to quote-unquote animal attacks, yet at the same time exhibit persistent discrepancies amidst their various explanations, often leaving us with more questions than answers. Whether the attacker was a mountain lion, a dog, a man, a dog man, or some altogether unclassified and entirely unknown creature, the results remain the same. A young life ended mysteriously and violently in a place that had seemed otherwise benign. The question still persists: who, or what, is actually responsible for the gruesome death of Christopher Whiteley? His body has long since been laid to rest, yet in Hood County, the rustle of leaves or the whispering of the winds across densely wooded fields, the story endures. Christopher Whiteley's death remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that the natural world can be unforgiving, and that sometimes the line between the ordinary and the unknown is thinner than we realize. Finally, we've got Charles Levin. In July 2019, Southern Oregon, a region of rolling hills, dense forests, and quiet, winding country roads. It's here in this seemingly ordinary forested landscape that film and TV actor Charles Levin disappeared, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions, gruesome rumors, and a story that would profoundly unsettle those that follow strange and tragic events. Levin was 70 years old, known for his character roles on television and in film, such as The Golden Girls or Seinfeld, probably the most well-known. He was the Moyle in that one episode with the circumcision, etc. He was also a man who valued his solitude. I can identify, as he was known for often retreating into the woods and rural landscapes he loved so much. Friends described him as eccentric but thoughtful, someone who preferred the company of nature to the bustle of Hollywood life. Others have said that he was something of a troubled man who was in fact dealing with some demons of a personal nature. Levin was last seen on a quiet summer morning. He was expected to eventually show up at a friend's home, yet never arrived. Days passed, then weeks, and inevitably the concern over his whereabouts grew. Local authorities and friends began to search the surrounding wooded areas, combing through local forests, abandoned roads, and remote trails. Then, several months later, devastated, naked remains were found deep within an isolated wooded area near a ravine. Law enforcement confirmed the discovery with reports stating that his body displayed heavy animal predation, most likely by turkey vultures, as deduced through the details available at the scene. Apparently and I'm using the phraseology from the sources here, apparently his external genitals, I've heard this a lot, most of the sources, his external genitals were missing. And there were even rumors that allegedly stated how his body was originally found suspended in the heights of a tree. The scene suggested that he'd been there for some time, hidden amidst the dense folds of the darkened forest. The circumstances immediately drew attention. Some reports suggested that his vehicle had been abandoned in an unusual location off an unpaved gravel road, partially hidden by brush and thoroughly damaged, raising many questions about the timeline of his disappearance. While official reports avoided speculation, locals whispered of strange signs, unusual markings on the ground, glimpses of shadowy figures at the edges of the road, and the unnaturally eerie silence that seemed to descend over the forest at night. Some rumors, unverified and quite often gruesome, circulated online, feeding the sense of mystery around Levin's death. None of these were confirmed, yet they persisted, as though the forest itself conspired to keep its secrets. Perhaps it was the Pacific Northwest location that's fueled some of the much stranger rumors, this supposedly being Bigfoot territory and all. This also tends to lead some of the theoretical threads connecting the unsettling state of Levin's remains into what is very disturbingly imaginative speculation, much of which insinuates or hints at rather graphic depictions of an inconceivably violent death. Investigators concluded that Levin likely died of natural causes or an accident related to his solitude in the wilderness. His state of undress is often attributed to quote-unquote paradoxical undressing, as this phenomena often does accompany many instances of hypothermia, whilst others counter this conclusion by mentioning that this incident occurred in the middle of July. There was no evidence of foul play, and yet the delays in his discovery, the hidden away location of his body, highly unusual circumstances surrounding his abandoned vehicle, along with all of the law enforcement involved being seemingly less than forthcoming with any official details, almost bordering on possible obfuscation or intentional omission. These are all factors that have lent an air of mystery which contributes to this particular story feeling somehow inexplicably different. For many, Levin's death became a mirror for the unknown, a reminder that even in a land that's been mapped and patrolled, nature retains unknown depths, and any human presence can instantaneously vanish as if into thin air. In the months following his death, friends and colleagues shared stories of Levin's love for solitude, his quirky habits, and his fascination with life's unpredictable rhythms. Some suggested that he'd chosen seclusion as a way to control the narrative of his final days. Others imagined that the forest itself had claimed him in ways that defy ordinary explanations, the sort of disappearance that lingers in the mind long after the available facts, as few as there may be. Charles Levin's death, like those of Neda Fornario, D. Scott Rogo, and Christopher Whiteley, leave us with mere fragments, objects, timelines, reports, and memories. Each piece fits together imperfectly, leaving gaps filled by human curiosity and fear of the unknown, as dread intersects with imagination. In the end, the story is not just about an individual that disappeared, but about the fragile line between the known and the unknown, the visible and the invisible, life and death, or the shadowy places in between we cannot fully comprehend. And perhaps that is the point, that even ordinary landscapes, ordinary lives, can still conceal mysteries, and sometimes the mystery remains long after we have left the scene. So we have 4 stories, 4 deaths, each leaving us with fragments, questions, and an uneasy awareness that the world is not always as it seems. Neda Fornario, lost on the misty Isle of Iona. D. Scott Rogo, silenced under violent and mysterious circumstances. Christopher Whiteley, taken in the quiet Texas countryside by a predator whose identity remains uncertain. And Charles Levin, lost in the deep woods and allegedly found in some of the most disturbing of circumstances. Each death differs in method, setting, and motive, yet they share a common thread: uncertainty. And uncertainty, as much as fear or grief, shapes the way we remember the departed and interpret the unexplained. Perhaps these aren't stories of tragedy alone. Perhaps they hint at something more. A hidden pattern, a shadow we cannot name. A reminder that life and death sometimes defy all explanation. That's going to be it for this episode. I've got more coming around the corner, folks. Really appreciate you guys listening in. This is going to be it for this particular episode of Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast. I'm your host, Mike Lucht, and I will see you on the next one.
lying in the gutter like a bum, like a dog, like a mutt, like a mongrel, like an animal.